Eleanor Patterson's trembling hand froze on the kitchen light switch, her breath catching in her throat as four massive German shepherds erupted into protective formation around her wheelchair-bound figure. The silence shattered as Max's deep growl vibrated through the darkened hallway, his 100-pound frame blocking the path between Eleanor and the three masked figures who had just kicked down her front door. This wasn't supposed to happen, not in quiet Millbrook, Vermont, not to a 72-year-old retired nurse living alone. The lead intruder's gun gleamed under the porch light as Duke lunged forward, his powerful jaws snapping inches from the man's wrist. Bella's protective snarl joined the chaos while shadows circled behind, their coordinated movements revealing years of devotion. Eleanor's arthritic fingers clutched Robert's old service revolver, the weight foreign yet familiar after 3 years of widowhood. "Call 911 now," she whispered to herself, watching her beloved dogs transform into fierce warriors. Who had sent these men to her door? And why did her own daughter's voice echo from the darkness outside? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 years earlier, Eleanor Patterson had been a different woman entirely. At 69, she still moved with the confident stride of someone who had spent 4 decades saving lives as a trauma nurse at Millbrook General Hospital. The small Vermont town had been her universe since birth, its tree-lined streets and close-knit community providing the perfect backdrop for a life well lived alongside her husband, Police Sergeant Robert Patterson. Their modest 2-story colonial on Maple Street had witnessed 43 years of marriage, filled with the laughter of their daughter Sarah and the steady rhythm of ordinary happiness. Robert's police scanner crackled from the kitchen counter each morning as Eleanor prepared his coffee, extra cream, no sugar. She could navigate their home blindfolded, knowing exactly which floorboards creaked and where the afternoon sunlight fell across the hardwood floors. Then came that devastating Tuesday in October when Robert collapsed in their garden while raking autumn leaves. The massive heart attack claimed him before the paramedics Eleanor had trained alongside could even respond to her frantic call. In one afternoon, her world contracted from a shared life to a solitary existence, the house suddenly echoing with a silence that felt almost suffocating. Sarah Patterson Mitchell, now a successful corporate lawyer in Boston, had immediately begun her campaign to relocate her mother. "Mom, you can't stay in that big house alone," became her weekly refrain during increasingly tense phone calls. The assisted living brochures arrived in Eleanor's mailbox like unwelcome soldiers, each one featuring smiling seniors engaged in activities that felt foreign to her independent spirit. Financial reality soon compounded Eleanor's grief. Robert's police pension provided bare sustenance, but the property taxes, heating bills, and mounting medical expenses created a mathematical equation that didn't balance. The house they had lovingly restored board by board was becoming an anchor, dragging her toward financial ruin. Eleanor found herself rationing medications, skipping meals, and wearing sweaters indoors to avoid turning up the thermostat. Enter Tom Bradley, a soft-spoken handyman in his late 40s who had attended Millbrook Elementary when Eleanor substitute taught there decades earlier. Tom appeared at her door one snowy morning, tool belt around his waist, claiming he owed her a debt for helping him through a difficult childhood. His gentle manner and skilled hands became Eleanor's lifeline as gutters were cleaned, steps were repaired, and small emergencies were handled with quiet efficiency. Yet Tom remained an enigma. He never sent bills, deflected questions about his own life, and possessed an uncanny knowledge of the house's quirks that seemed impossible for someone who had supposedly never been inside. Eleanor noticed how his weathered hands trembled slightly when he handled Robert's tools, and how his blue eyes held a sadness that seemed disproportionate to their casual acquaintance. The isolation was slowly consuming Eleanor's spirit. She began talking to Robert's photograph each morning, setting 2 coffee cups out of habit and finding herself grateful for even the mailman's brief daily interaction. The woman who had once commanded emergency rooms with calm authority was becoming a shadow of herself, trapped between her daughter's expectations and her own stubborn refusal to abandon the only home she had ever known. The March morning when Tom Bradley arrived with 4 tiny bundles in his arms marked the beginning of Eleanor's resurrection from grief. She had been sitting at her kitchen table staring at another stack of overdue bills when his familiar knock interrupted her despair. Through the window, she could see his pickup truck idling in the driveway, exhaust visible in the crisp spring air. "Mrs. Patterson, I need your help," Tom said quietly when she opened the door. His usually steady voice carried an urgency she had never heard before. Cradled against his worn flannel shirt were 4 German shepherd puppies, their eyes barely open, bodies trembling with cold and hunger. "Found them beside Route 108 early this morning. Their mama was hit by a logging truck sometime during the night." Eleanor's nurse instincts kicked in immediately. She could see the puppies were severely dehydrated, their tiny ribs visible through matted fur. "Bring them inside quickly," she commanded, her voice regaining the authority that had once directed emergency room teams. "Put them on the kitchen table and get me some warm towels from the linen closet upstairs." As Tom hurried to follow her instructions, Eleanor began her assessment. The largest puppy, a male with distinctive markings around his eyes, was the strongest but still dangerously weak. 2 females huddled together, while the smallest male lay motionless except for shallow breathing. She had seen this before in human patients, the edge between life and death where every minute mattered. "They can't be more than 6 weeks old," Eleanor murmured, gently examining each puppy. "Too young to be weaned. We need milk substitute, heating pads, and round-the-clock care." She looked up at Tom, who stood watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "This is going to be expensive, and I can barely afford to feed myself." Tom reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out 3 crisp $100 bills. "I've got it covered," he said simply. "These little ones need you, Mrs. Patterson, and maybe you need them too." Something in his tone made Eleanor study his face more carefully. There was a familiarity in his features that had always nagged at her. Something about the way he tilted his head when thinking, or how his hands moved with surprising gentleness for such a large man. But the urgency of the moment pushed those thoughts aside as the smallest puppy began to shiver violently. The next 72 hours blurred together in a cycle of feeding, warming, and vigilant monitoring. Eleanor transformed her living room into a makeshift nursery, using heating pads and soft blankets to create a warm environment. She fed the puppies every 2 hours with bottles and milk formula, her arthritic hands moving with remembered precision. Tom appeared regularly with supplies, always seeming to know exactly what was needed before she asked. "You're a natural at this," he observed on the 3rd day, watching Eleanor coax the smallest puppy to take his bottle. "Like you've done it before." 40 years of nursing teaches you to read what living things need," Eleanor replied, but something deeper stirred in her memory. She had always wanted more children after Sarah, but complications during delivery had made that impossible. These tiny, helpless creatures were filling a void she hadn't realized still existed. By the end of the 1st week, all 4 puppies were thriving. Eleanor had named them: Max for the bold leader, Duke for the protector who always positioned himself between the others and any perceived threat, Bella for the gentle female who seemed to sense Eleanor's moods, and Shadow for the quiet, intelligent one who watched everything with ancient wisdom in his dark eyes. Tom's mysterious generosity continued to puzzle Eleanor. When she questioned him about the money, he became evasive, changing the subject or suddenly remembering urgent work elsewhere. She noticed he never actually left bills, despite hours of repairs around her house. His truck, while old, was well maintained and expensive tools filled its bed. For a handyman in rural Vermont, Tom Bradley seemed remarkably well-funded. "Tom," Eleanor said one afternoon as he repaired her back steps while the puppies played in the yard, "I need to know where this money is coming from." "I can't accept charity if you're putting yourself in hardship." He paused in his hammering, his shoulders tensing. "It's not charity, Mrs. Patterson. It's something I owe. Something I've owed for a very long time." His voice carried a weight of emotion that made Eleanor's chest tighten with recognition she couldn't quite place. The puppies had grown rapidly in their first month, already showing the distinctive intelligence and loyalty of their breed. Eleanor found herself talking to them constantly, explaining her daily routine, sharing memories of Robert, even reading aloud from books. The house that had felt like a tomb began to pulse with life again. She was sleeping better, eating regularly, and had even started wearing makeup again. But questions about Tom's identity and resources continued to gnaw at her, especially when she caught him staring at family photographs with an expression of profound longing that seemed far too personal for their casual relationship. The turning point arrived on a humid August afternoon when Sarah's silver BMW pulled into Eleanor's driveway with an aggressive crunch of gravel. Eleanor watched from her kitchen window as her daughter emerged, designer heels clicking against the walkway with military precision. The 4 German shepherds, now 6 months old and approaching full size, immediately formed a protective line along the front porch, their ears alert and bodies tense. "Mother, we need to talk," Sarah announced as she swept through the front door without invitation. Her tailored suit and sharp bob haircut seemed incongruous in the homey kitchen where Eleanor had been preparing the dog's evening meal. "This situation has gone far enough." Eleanor straightened her shoulders, feeling the familiar weight of confrontation settling between them. "What situation would that be, dear?" "These animals." Sarah gestured dismissively toward the dogs visible through the screen door. "Neighbors have been calling me, Mother. Mrs. Henderson says they're too large, too aggressive. The mail carrier is afraid to deliver packages. You're creating a liability nightmare." The accusation stung because Eleanor knew it contained fragments of truth. Max had grown to nearly 90 pounds of solid muscle, his protective instincts making him suspicious of strangers. Duke's territorial behavior had indeed caused the UPS driver to leave packages at the end of the driveway. But these dogs had given Eleanor purpose, companionship, and unconditional love during the darkest period of her life. "They've never hurt anyone," Eleanor said quietly. "They're protective, yes, but they're good dogs." Sarah's laugh carried no warmth. "Good dogs don't cost $1,500 a month in food and veterinary bills. Good dogs don't prevent their elderly owners from making rational decisions about their future." She pulled a thick manila folder from her briefcase and spread documents across the kitchen table. "I've found you a beautiful assisted living facility in Burlington. Cedar Grove Manor has an excellent reputation, and the monthly cost is actually less than what you're spending to maintain this house." Eleanor felt her world tilting as she recognized legal papers, application forms, and glossy brochures featuring smiling seniors engaged in organized activities. "You had no right to—" "I have every right," Sarah interrupted, her voice rising. "I'm your daughter, and I'm watching you deteriorate in this isolated house with a pack of dangerous animals. Look at yourself, Mother. When's the last time you had a proper meal? When did you last see a doctor? You're living like a hermit." The kitchen door opened as Tom entered, carrying supplies for the fence repair he'd been working on all week. His presence immediately shifted the dynamic in the room, Sarah's professional composure faltering slightly as she took in his work clothes and confident manner. "Tom Bradley," he introduced himself, extending a calloused hand that Sarah reluctantly shook. "I help Mrs. Patterson with maintenance around the house." "How convenient," Sarah's tone turned glacial. "And I suppose you're being paid well for these services?" Eleanor watched Tom's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Your mother is a good woman who deserves help. Some things aren't about money. Everything is about money when you're 72 years old and living on a fixed income, Sarah snapped. She turned back to Eleanor, her expression softening into what Eleanor recognized as her daughter's courtroom manipulation face. Mom, I know this is hard, but we need to be practical. The property taxes alone are eating your savings. You can't afford to keep this house and 4 large dogs. The financial reality hit Eleanor like cold water. The truth was undeniable. Between dog food, veterinary bills, and household expenses, she was hemorrhaging money she didn't have. The foreclosure notice tucked behind the coffee canister proved Sarah's point more effectively than any argument. "What happens to the dogs?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely audible. Sarah's pause lasted a heartbeat too long. "There are excellent facilities for animals whose owners can no longer care for them. The Humane Society will find them appropriate homes." "You mean you want me to abandon them?" Eleanor's words carried a steel that surprised even herself. "These dogs saved my life, Sarah. After your father died, I was drowning. They gave me a reason to get up each morning." "Sentimentality won't pay the bills," Sarah replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "Mom, I'm trying to help you. Cedar Grove has activities, medical staff on site, people your own age, you'll make friends, have social interaction." "I have social interaction," Eleanor interrupted, gesturing toward Tom. "I have friends. I have a home." Tom had remained silent during the exchange, but Eleanor noticed how his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, how his breathing had become measured and controlled. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an intensity that made both women look at him sharply. "Mrs. Patterson has the right to live where she chooses," he said quietly. "She's not incompetent. She's not a danger to herself or others. And those dogs are the best trained animals I've ever seen. Maybe the problem isn't her living situation. Maybe the problem is family members who don't visit often enough to understand what she actually needs." Sarah's composure cracked completely. "Excuse me, you don't know anything about our family situation. My mother is being manipulated by someone who clearly has his own agenda." Her eyes narrowed as she studied Tom's face. "What exactly is your interest in this, Mr. Bradley? Are you hoping to inherit something? Because I can assure you—" "Sarah!" Eleanor's sharp rebuke cut through the room like a blade. "That's enough. Tom has been nothing but kind and helpful. He's never asked for anything in return." But Sarah's accusation had found its mark. Eleanor had wondered about Tom's mysterious generosity, his inexplicable knowledge of her house, his emotional investment in her welfare. Watching him now, she saw something flicker across his features: pain, guilt, and something else she couldn't identify. "I think," Tom said slowly, "there are things that need to be discussed, but maybe not like this." He looked directly at Eleanor. "Mrs. Patterson, you should know that—" A thunderous crash from the backyard interrupted him as all 4 dogs began barking in unison. Through the window, Eleanor could see a figure moving through her garden, someone who clearly didn't belong. Max and Duke were already racing toward the intruder, their protective instincts in full display. "See?" Sarah said triumphantly. "This is exactly what I mean. You can't control them. What happens when they actually attack someone?" But Eleanor was watching Tom's reaction to the commotion, noting how he immediately moved to position himself between her and the window, how his body language shifted into something that looked almost military. For a man who claimed to be a simple handyman, Tom Bradley seemed remarkably prepared for trouble. The moment hung suspended between revelation and crisis, with family tensions, financial pressures, and unspoken secrets creating a perfect storm that would soon engulf them all. The figure in Eleanor's garden turned out to be a false alarm, a teenage neighbor retrieving a soccer ball. But the incident crystallized the growing tensions surrounding her living situation. Over the following months, the pressure from multiple directions intensified like a slowly tightening vice around her daily existence. Sarah's campaign to relocate her mother became increasingly sophisticated and relentless. The assisted living brochures evolved into scheduled tours, complete with transportation arrangements Eleanor hadn't requested. Professional care assessments appeared in her mailbox, along with detailed financial projections showing her inevitable bankruptcy if she continued her current lifestyle. Most unsettling were the unexpected visits from concerned neighbors who seemed remarkably well informed about Eleanor's private affairs. "Mrs. Patterson," said Dr. Margaret Winters, a geriatric specialist who arrived unannounced on a crisp October morning, "Your daughter has expressed concerns about your safety living alone with such large animals. I'd like to conduct a brief evaluation of your living situation." Eleanor found herself subjected to questions about her medication management, fall risks, and cognitive function, while the 4 German shepherds watched suspiciously from their positions around the living room. The dogs seemed to sense the threat this pleasant woman represented, positioning themselves protectively without displaying overt aggression. "I see you've formed quite an attachment to these animals," Dr. Winters observed, making notes on her tablet. "Large dogs can be challenging for someone your age. Have you considered the physical demands of their care as you continue aging?" The question struck at Eleanor's deepest fears. At 72, she was acutely aware of her physical limitations. Some mornings, her arthritis made it difficult to open the heavy dog food containers. Walking 4 large dogs required strength and balance she wasn't certain she could maintain indefinitely. Yet the thought of surrendering them felt like contemplating suicide. Tom's presence during these evaluations provided both comfort and confusion. He appeared at exactly the right moments, demonstrating the dog's training and Eleanor's competent care. His knowledge of canine behavior seemed encyclopedic, and his ability to command the dog's attention was remarkable for someone who claimed no special expertise with animals. "Those dogs respond to you like you've trained them from birth," Eleanor observed one afternoon as Tom effortlessly guided all 4 through a complex obedience routine. "Where did you learn to work with German shepherds?" Tom's hands stilled on Max's collar, his expression becoming carefully neutral. "Picked things up over the years." "Smart breeds like this, they want to please. Just takes patience and consistency." But Eleanor noticed how his commands were given in what sounded like professional terminology, how he instinctively checked the dog's stance and attention in ways that suggested formal training. When Shadow limped slightly after a particularly energetic play session, Tom's examination was thorough and knowledgeable, his hands moving with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before. The mysterious, threatening letters escalated during this period, arriving with disturbing regularity. "Your isolation makes you vulnerable," read one typed message. "Consider the consequences of stubborn independence." Eleanor assumed they came from Sarah's increasingly desperate attempts at psychological pressure, but their tone carried a menace that seemed excessive even for her daughter's manipulative tendencies. Tom's reaction to these letters was immediate and intense. He installed new locks, reinforced door frames, and began what he called routine security checks that seemed anything but routine. Eleanor watched him examine her property with the systematic thoroughness of someone conducting a professional threat assessment. "Tom, you're starting to worry me," Eleanor said one evening as he tested the new motion sensor lights for the 3rd time. "These are just Sarah's scare tactics. She's trying to prove I'm not safe here." "Maybe," Tom replied, but his eyes continued scanning the tree line beyond her property. "But maybe it's better to be prepared for anything." The financial pressure intensified as winter approached. Eleanor's heating bills soared, and the dog's food costs seemed to multiply as they reached full adult size. Max now weighed nearly 100 pounds. Duke wasn't far behind, and even Bella tipped the scales at 80 pounds. Their combined daily food consumption would feed a small family, and their veterinary care rivaled human medical expenses. The breaking point came when Bella fell ill with what the veterinarian diagnosed as a serious intestinal blockage requiring emergency surgery. The estimate of $4,000 for the procedure represented more money than Eleanor had seen in one place since Robert's death. "I can't afford this," Eleanor whispered to Tom as they sat in the veterinary clinic's waiting room, Bella's labored breathing audible from the examination room. "I can barely afford groceries for myself, let alone emergency surgery for her." Tom was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded in his lap. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of emotion that made Eleanor look at him sharply. "What if I told you the money isn't a problem? That Bella can have whatever care she needs? I can't keep accepting your charity, Tom." "I don't even know where you get this kind of money. Are you independently wealthy, drug dealer, bank robber?" Eleanor's attempt at humor fell flat as she watched his face close off completely. "It's not charity," he said quietly. It's something I owe, a debt that can never be fully repaid." Before Eleanor could press him for explanation, the veterinarian emerged with surgical consent forms and a grave expression. Bella's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and delay could prove fatal. Without hesitation, Tom produced a credit card and signed the authorization papers, his movements decisive and final. During the 6-hour surgery, Eleanor found herself studying Tom's profile as he maintained his vigil in the uncomfortable plastic chairs. There was something hauntingly familiar about the set of his shoulders, the way he rubbed his forehead when worried, the unconscious habit of tugging at his left ear. These gestures stirred memories she couldn't quite grasp, like trying to remember a dream after waking. "Tom," she said softly, "how long have you really known me?" His blue eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Longer than you think, Mrs. Patterson. Much longer than you think." The cryptic response hung between them as the veterinarian returned with news that Bella's surgery had been successful. The relief Eleanor felt was overwhelming, but it was accompanied by a growing certainty that Tom Bradley was not who he claimed to be. Over the following weeks, as Bella recovered and Eleanor's financial situation became increasingly desperate, strange coincidences began accumulating. Bills that should have resulted in service disconnections somehow remained current. The property tax notice that would have triggered foreclosure proceedings mysteriously disappeared from her mailbox, replaced by a receipt showing full payment. When Eleanor called the town office to report the error, she was told an anonymous benefactor had settled her account in full. Sarah's response to these developments was explosive. "Someone is playing games with your finances, Mother. This anonymous benefactor story is ridiculous. Who has that kind of money and that level of interest in your welfare?" Eleanor had been wondering the same thing. The amounts involved suggested someone with substantial resources and detailed knowledge of her financial obligations. The precision of the payments, never more than necessary, always exactly what was required, indicated intimate familiarity with her situation. Tom's behavior became increasingly protective and mysterious. He began staying later each day, often until well after dark, and Eleanor noticed him making phone calls in hushed tones from her backyard. When she questioned him about these conversations, he became evasive, claiming they were work-related communications. The dog's behavior toward Tom also puzzled Eleanor. While they were protective of her around strangers, they treated Tom with a deference that seemed almost reverent. Max, the alpha of the group, consistently deferred to Tom's authority in ways that suggested a bond deeper than casual acquaintance. Shadow, the most intelligent and observant of the four, watched Tom with an intensity that seemed almost human in its focused attention. One evening in November, Eleanor discovered Tom in Robert's study, sitting at the desk where her late husband had worked on police cases. He was examining old files and photographs with an absorption that seemed inappropriate for a casual helper. When he realized she was watching, his face flushed with what looked like guilt. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, standing and moving away from the desk. The drawer was stuck and I was trying to fix it." These fell out. But Eleanor could see that the files were specific ones, missing person cases from Robert's career, including several involving children. The photographs scattered across the desk showed age progression images and evidence photos that should have been returned to the department when Robert retired. "Tom," Eleanor said carefully, "what are you really looking for?" His answer was interrupted by the sound of breaking glass from the kitchen, followed by the 4 dogs erupting into protective barking that filled the house with urgent warning. Someone had just thrown a brick through Eleanor's window, and this time it wasn't a false alarm. The brick that shattered Eleanor's kitchen window carried more than broken glass into her home. It brought with it a handwritten note that transformed her world from uncomfortable uncertainty into immediate terror. Tom reached the kitchen first, his movements swift and protective as he positioned himself between Eleanor and the gaping hole where her window had been. The 4 German shepherds were in full alert mode, their deep barks echoing through the house as they scanned for threats. "Stay back," Tom commanded, with an authority that made Eleanor obey instinctively. He carefully extracted the note from where it had landed among the glass shards, his face darkening as he read the crude message. "Last warning, old woman. Send the dogs away, or face the consequences. You have 48 hours." Eleanor felt her knees weaken as the implications sank in. This wasn't Sarah's psychological manipulation or empty neighborhood complaints. Someone had been watching her house, planning this escalation, and was now making direct threats. The dog's protective instincts, which had seemed excessive before, suddenly appeared inadequate against an unknown enemy with violent intentions. "We're calling the police," Eleanor said, reaching for the phone with trembling hands. But Tom's firm grip on her wrist stopped her. "Wait," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the broken window. "Let me secure the house first. Whoever did this might still be out there." Eleanor watched in amazement as Tom transformed before her eyes. Gone was the gentle handyman who fixed her gutters and played with her dogs. In his place stood someone who moved with military precision, checking sight lines, examining the brick for evidence, and coordinating the dog's positioning with professional efficiency. Max responded to his silent hand signals like a trained police dog, while Duke and Shadow took positions at strategic points around the house. "Tom, who are you?" Eleanor whispered, but he was already on his cell phone, speaking in clipped tones to someone who apparently took his calls at midnight without question. "I need a security sweep and perimeter watch at the Patterson residence on Maple Street," he said with quiet urgency. "Immediate threat. Escalating situation. Bring the trauma kit and night vision equipment." Eleanor's mind reeled as she processed his words. Trauma kit? Night vision equipment? What kind of handyman had access to military-grade resources and spoke like someone accustomed to coordinating tactical responses? Within 20 minutes, 2 men in dark clothing arrived at Eleanor's back door, moving through her yard with the silent efficiency of Special Forces operatives. Tom greeted them with familiarity, exchanging information in a professional shorthand that excluded Eleanor entirely. She watched from her living room window as they conducted what appeared to be a sophisticated security assessment of her property. "Mrs. Patterson," Tom said when he returned to the house, his expression grave, "we found evidence of surveillance equipment around your property. Someone has been watching your daily routines for weeks, possibly months. This isn't random vandalism." The revelation hit Eleanor like a physical blow. The thought that unknown eyes had been observing her most private moments, her morning routine with the dogs, her evening struggles with loneliness, her vulnerable moments of grief, felt like a violation beyond comprehension. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I'm nobody special. I don't have anything worth stealing. Why would someone target me?" Tom's hesitation lasted only a moment, but Eleanor caught it. He knew more than he was saying, and his knowledge carried the weight of personal involvement rather than professional speculation. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "people become targets because of who they are to other people. Sometimes the threat isn't about what you have, but about what you represent." Before Eleanor could demand clarification, her phone rang with the harsh insistence of emergency. The caller ID showed Sarah's number, but when Eleanor answered, her daughter's voice carried a panic that immediately alarmed her. "Mom, thank God you're okay," Sarah gasped, her professional composure completely shattered. "I just got a call from someone claiming they have information about Dad's old cases. They said you're in danger because of something he was investigating when he died. Mom, you need to get out of that house right now." Eleanor felt the room spinning as fragments of information began forming a terrifying picture. Robert's missing case files, Tom's mysterious knowledge of police procedures, the surveillance equipment around her property, these weren't random coincidences, but pieces of a puzzle she was only beginning to understand. "Sarah, slow down," Eleanor said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "What exactly did this person tell you?" "They said Dad was close to solving a 30-year-old kidnapping case when he died. Something about a missing child and a cover-up involving local officials. Mom, they think someone killed Dad to stop his investigation, and now they're targeting you because you might have evidence." The kitchen fell silent except for the dog's continued low growling and the sound of Eleanor's ragged breathing. Tom's face had gone completely white, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. When he spoke, his voice carried a tremor she had never heard before. "What was the name of the missing child?" he asked quietly. Eleanor repeated the question to Sarah, whose response made the blood drain from her face. "Thomas Brennan. He was 18 months old when he disappeared from a grocery store parking lot. Dad had new evidence. Something about the original investigation being deliberately sabotaged." Tom Bradley's reaction was immediate and devastating. He staggered backward as if struck, his breathing becoming labored and irregular. Eleanor watched in horror as this strong, capable man who had been her protector began to hyperventilate, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "Tom!" Eleanor reached for him, but he pulled away, his eyes wide with a pain so profound it was almost unbearable to witness. "I have to tell you something," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I should have told you months ago, but I was afraid. I was so afraid you'd reject me again." "Again?" Eleanor's confusion deepened as Tom reached into his wallet and pulled out a faded photograph. With trembling hands, he placed it on the kitchen table where the light would illuminate it clearly. The photograph showed a young Eleanor and Robert, both in their early 30s, standing in what appeared to be the same kitchen where they now stood. Between them was a toddler with bright blue eyes and a mischievous smile, his small hands reaching toward the camera. Eleanor's breath caught as she recognized the child's features. The same eyes now looking at her from Tom's adult face, the same stubborn chin, the same unconscious gesture of tugging at his left ear when nervous. "Thomas Brennan was my birth name," Tom said quietly, "but you knew me as Tommy. I was your son, Mom. I was stolen from you 30 years ago, and I've been trying to find my way home ever since." The kitchen erupted into chaos as Eleanor's knees buckled and she crashed to the floor. The dogs immediately surrounded her, whining with distress as Tom, her son, her lost baby, knelt beside her with tears streaming down his face. Through the broken window, the sound of approaching vehicles suggested that the night's revelations were far from over. "The people who took me," Tom continued through his tears. "They're still out there. They killed Dad because he was getting too close to the truth. And now they're coming for you, because they think he told you what he discovered." Eleanor's world had shattered more completely than her kitchen window. Her son, presumed dead for 3 decades, had been caring for her all along. The man she had mourned as a baby was now protecting her as an adult. And the people responsible for destroying her family were still hunting them, still willing to kill to protect their secrets. As sirens wailed in the distance and the dogs maintained their protective circle around mother and son, Eleanor realized that the real battle for her survival was just beginning. The attack came 3 hours before dawn on a moonless December night when Eleanor's defenses were at their weakest. She had fallen into an exhausted sleep in Robert's old recliner, surrounded by the protective circle of her 4 German shepherds, while Tom maintained watch from the kitchen window. The emotional revelation of his true identity had drained both mother and son, leaving them vulnerable despite the security measures Tom's associates had implemented around the property. Marcus Reed and his 2 accomplices moved through Eleanor's backyard with the practiced silence of predators. The former military training that had been stripped from Marcus in disgrace now served his criminal purposes as he led Jake Morrison and Paul Hendricks toward the house that had become their obsession. Marcus had been watching Eleanor Patterson for months, noting her routines, cataloging her vulnerabilities, and planning the perfect moment to strike. The psychological profile Marcus had developed of his target was methodical and cruel. He knew Eleanor lived on a fixed income that barely covered necessities. He understood her emotional attachment to the dogs made her predictable and manipulable. Most importantly, he had recognized that her isolation made her the perfect victim for the type of psychological torture that had become his specialty since his military discharge. Marcus's hatred of German shepherds traced back to a childhood trauma that had shaped his entire worldview. At age 7, he had been savagely attacked by a neighbor's police dog during what should have been routine play. The physical scars had healed, but the psychological damage had festered for decades, manifesting as an irrational rage toward the breed and, by extension, the elderly woman who had chosen to surround herself with 4 of them. The breaking point in Marcus's deteriorating mental state had come with his dishonorable discharge from the Army Rangers. Years of specialized training in psychological warfare and tactical infiltration had been rendered worthless by a single incident of excessive violence against a civilian contractor. The rage that had made him effective in combat became a liability in peacetime, leaving him unemployed, unemployable, and seething with resentment against a society that had discarded him. Tom's security preparations, sophisticated as they were, could not account for Marcus's professional-level training and intimate knowledge of the property. While Tom's associates had focused on perimeter security and electronic surveillance, Marcus had identified the house's structural weaknesses through careful observation. The basement access point that Robert had installed for emergency use had never been properly secured, providing the perfect entry route for someone with Marcus's skills. The first sign of trouble came when Shadow's ears pricked up with supernatural alertness. The most intelligent of the 4 dogs, Shadow had been bred for protection work and possessed an almost mystical ability to sense danger before it materialized. His low growl was barely audible, but it was enough to wake Max, whose own protective instincts immediately engaged. Eleanor stirred in her chair as the dog's tension communicated itself to her sleeping mind. After months of living with these animals, she had developed an intuitive understanding of their alarm signals. Shadow's focused attention toward the basement stairs meant something was fundamentally wrong with their secure environment. Tom appeared in the living room doorway with the silent speed of someone whose survival had once depended on such movements. His hand signals directed the dogs into defensive positions while he moved to check the basement access. The coordination between man and animals revealed months of preparation that Eleanor was only now beginning to understand. The basement door exploded inward with the force of Marcus's tactical breach. Two flashbang grenades rolled across the floor, their detonation designed to disorient and incapacitate the house's defenders. The ear-splitting noise and blinding light would have overwhelmed ordinary victims, but Tom's military training kicked in automatically as he shielded Eleanor from the worst effects, while the dogs, bred for police work, recovered faster than anticipated. Marcus Reed emerged from the basement like a nightmare materialized. His tactical gear and night vision equipment gave him significant advantages, but he had not anticipated the coordinated response of 4 German shepherds who had bonded with their charges on a level that transcended ordinary pet relationships. These dogs had been living as Eleanor's guardians for over a year, and their protective instincts had been honed to perfection. The battle that erupted in Eleanor's living room was unlike anything the quiet Vermont town had ever witnessed. Max, weighing nearly 100 pounds of solid muscle, launched himself at Marcus with the fury of a wolf protecting his pack. His powerful jaws sought the intruder's throat while his momentum drove Marcus backward into the hallway. Duke and Shadow flanked the attack, their tactical intelligence evident as they prevented Marcus's escape routes. Jake Morrison made the fatal mistake of threatening Eleanor directly, pointing his weapon at her defenseless form in the recliner. Bella, despite her gentler nature, transformed into a protective fury that would have impressed her police dog ancestors. Her attack on Morrison was swift and devastating, her teeth finding the wrist that held his gun and refusing to release despite his panicked attempts to shake her off. Paul Hendricks found himself facing Tom Bradley, and the contrast between military training and desperate criminality became immediately apparent. Tom's hand-to-hand combat skills had been refined through years of specialized training, while Hendricks relied on intimidation and crude violence. The encounter lasted less than 30 seconds before Hendricks was unconscious on Eleanor's hardwood floor. But Marcus Reed was proving more dangerous than anticipated. His own military background, combined with desperate fury and chemical enhancement from methamphetamines, made him a formidable opponent even for the coordinated assault of 3 German shepherds. When Max's attack drove him to the ground, Marcus managed to pull a combat knife from his boot, slashing at the dog's exposed flank. The sight of Max's blood on her living room floor triggered something primal in Eleanor Patterson. This woman who had spent 40 years saving lives in hospital emergency rooms was not about to watch helplessly as violence invaded her home and threatened her family. Robert's service revolver, which she had kept loaded in the kitchen drawer, was suddenly in her arthritic hands. "Get away from my dog," Eleanor commanded with a voice that carried 4 decades of authority from trauma units where life and death decisions were made in seconds. The gun in her hands was steady despite her age, her nursing training having prepared her for crisis situations that would overwhelm most people. Marcus's laugh was the sound of madness given voice. "Old woman thinks she's going to save the day. You can't even save yourself." His knife moved toward Max's throat as the wounded dog struggled to maintain his protective position between the intruder and Eleanor. Tom's voice cut through the chaos with desperate urgency. "Mom, he's wearing body armor. The headshot is your only option." The word "Mom," spoken aloud for the first time in 30 years, gave Eleanor the strength she needed. Her finger tightened on the trigger as Marcus's blade descended toward Max's neck, but the shot that rang out was not from her weapon. Through the shattered front door came Detective Sarah Patterson Mitchell, her service weapon drawn and her police training evident as she assessed the tactical situation in seconds. Her shot took Marcus Reed center mass, the impact spinning him away from Max and into the wall where he slumped with a look of surprise that would be his final expression. "Police! Everyone on the ground!" Sarah shouted as backup officers poured through the doors and windows. The living room that had been Eleanor's sanctuary was now a crime scene, blood and broken furniture marking the spots where her family had fought for their lives. Max lay motionless beside Eleanor's chair, his breathing shallow and his eyes clouded with pain. The knife wound in his flank was deep and bleeding freely, requiring immediate medical attention that might not arrive in time. Eleanor knelt beside him, her hands applying pressure to the wound, while her voice whispered the words of comfort she had once given to human patients facing uncertain outcomes. "Hold on, Max," she murmured through tears that had been building for 30 years. "You saved us all. Now let us save you." The trauma that followed the attack cut deeper than any physical wound Marcus Reed had inflicted. In the sterile waiting room of the Millbrook Emergency Veterinary Clinic, Eleanor sat motionless while Max fought for his life on the operating table, the knife wound having nicked an artery that required delicate surgical repair. The irony was not lost on her that after 40 years of saving human lives, she was powerless to help the one being who had risked everything to protect her. Tom sat beside her, his own injuries from the fight wrapped in white bandages that made him look vulnerable despite his military training. The man she had known as a helpful handyman was gone forever, replaced by the son whose absence had haunted every day of the past 30 years. Yet even this miraculous reunion felt hollow while Max's fate remained uncertain in the operating room. Sarah stood across the waiting room, her police uniform rumpled and her face bearing the exhaustion of someone whose world had been turned upside down in a single night. The revelation of Tom's true identity had shattered her understanding of their family history as completely as it had Eleanor's. The brother she had never known, the kidnapping that had destroyed their parents' marriage in all but name, the decades of searching and hoping, all of it was condensing into a reality too overwhelming to fully process. "I should have recognized you," Eleanor whispered to Tom, her voice barely audible in the antiseptic silence. "A mother should know her own child." Tom's weathered hand found hers, the touch carrying the weight of 30 years of separation. "You weren't supposed to recognize me." "I was taken when I was barely talking, and the people who raised me made sure I never knew my real name until I was old enough to start asking questions they couldn't answer." The story Tom told in that waiting room was a nightmare of calculated cruelty and institutional failure. The couple who had kidnapped him, Harold and Martha Brennan, had been struggling with infertility when they spotted Eleanor and baby Thomas in the grocery store parking lot. Harold's moment of desperate impulse had torn a family apart, but in their twisted logic they believed they were saving a child from parents who were too young and too poor to provide properly. "They weren't monsters," Tom said quietly, his voice carrying the complex emotions of someone who had loved his captors while mourning his stolen life. "They truly believed they were giving me a better life. Harold worked 2 jobs to send me to college. Martha never missed a school event. But they also made sure I never questioned why I had no extended family, no baby pictures, no connections to any history before age 2. The psychological manipulation that had kept Tom from discovering his true identity was sophisticated and heartbreaking. The Brennans had moved frequently during his childhood, always claiming job opportunities required relocation. They homeschooled him until high school, limiting his exposure to missing child databases and age progression photos that might have triggered recognition. Most cruelly, they had convinced him that his birth parents had died in a car accident, making any search for his origins seem pointless and disrespectful to their memory. "When did you learn the truth?" Sarah asked, her police training compelling her to gather facts even as her emotions reeled from the revelations. Tom's laugh was bitter. "Harold confessed on his deathbed 6 years ago. Lung cancer gave him time to develop a conscience, I guess. He told me everything. My real name, where I was taken from, even showed me newspaper clippings he'd kept about the search efforts. Martha had already died from Alzheimer's, but in her final lucid moments, she kept calling me Thomas, and asking when my real mommy was coming to get me. The cruelest revelation was yet to come. Tom had spent 3 years researching his stolen identity, learning about the parents who had never stopped searching for him, following the investigation that had consumed Robert Patterson's final years. When he finally worked up the courage to approach his birth family, he discovered that Robert had died just months earlier, taking with him the active investigation that might have led to their reunion. "I was too late," Tom continued, his voice breaking. "Dad died believing he had failed to find me. I could have contacted you directly, but I was terrified you'd blame me for disappearing, for not fighting harder to come home, for loving the people who stole me. So I decided to watch from a distance, to help however I could, and maybe work up the courage to tell you who I was." Eleanor's heart shattered as she understood the magnitude of her son's sacrifice. For 2 years, Tom had been her anonymous benefactor, paying bills she couldn't afford, arranging for repairs she desperately needed, providing companionship through the 4 puppies whose care had given her purpose. He had been loving her from the shadows, protecting her without claiming the recognition and relationship he deserved. "The dogs," Eleanor said suddenly, understanding flooding through her grief. "You didn't just find them abandoned. You brought them to me specifically." Tom nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "German shepherds are bred for protection and loyalty. I knew you needed both, and I thought maybe taking care of them would help with the loneliness. I never imagined they'd save your life, but somehow it feels like Dad's spirit guided that choice." The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the veterinary surgeon, whose grim expression immediately communicated the gravity of Max's condition. "The surgery went as well as could be expected," she began, but her hesitation suggested complications. "We've repaired the arterial damage and stopped the bleeding, but Max lost a significant amount of blood. His heart is strong, but he's not out of danger yet." Eleanor felt the room tilting as the full implications sank in. Max, who had been her protector, companion, and link to sanity during the darkest period of her life, might not survive his heroic defense of her family. The dog who had positioned himself between her and danger without hesitation was now fighting a battle she couldn't help him win. "There's something else," Dr. Walsh continued gently. "During our examination, we discovered that Max has an underlying heart condition, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. It's genetic in German shepherds, and the stress of tonight's attack has put additional strain on his cardiovascular system. Even if he recovers from the surgery, his long-term prognosis is uncertain." The medical terminology felt like a physical blow to Eleanor, who understood exactly what the diagnosis meant. Max's heart was enlarged and struggling, a condition that would progressively worsen regardless of tonight's trauma. The dog who had saved her life was facing his own mortality with the same courage he had shown against Marcus Reed. Sarah approached her mother for the first time since the revelations began, her professional demeanor cracking to reveal the confused daughter beneath. "Mom, I'm so sorry. About everything. About pushing you to leave, about not believing you could take care of yourself, about not being here when you needed me most." The apology hung in the air between them, weighted with years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding. Eleanor looked at her daughter, successful, accomplished, but somehow smaller and more vulnerable than the elderly woman she had been trying to protect, and felt the anger that had been building for months finally finding its voice. "You hired those men?" Eleanor said quietly, her words cutting through the waiting room like surgical instruments. "Sarah, you hired Marcus Reed to intimidate me." The accusation detonated like another flashbang grenade in the small space. Tom's head snapped up, his newly revealed protective instincts immediately engaging as he processed what his mother had said. Sarah's face went through a spectrum of emotions: denial, recognition, and finally devastated admission. "Not to hurt you," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Never to hurt you. I hired him to stage a break-in, something minor that would prove you weren't safe living alone. He was supposed to take a few things, make some noise, scare you enough that you'd accept the move to Cedar Grove Manor. It was supposed to be theater, Mom. Just convincing theater." Eleanor's world collapsed for the second time in a single night. Her own daughter, the child she had raised with love and sacrifice, had orchestrated the terror that had nearly destroyed her family. The break-in that had ended with Max fighting for his life had begun as Sarah's manipulation, a calculated betrayal designed to force her mother's compliance. "He went rogue," Sarah continued desperately. "I never authorized violence. When I tried to call it off after you refused to move, Marcus demanded more money and threatened to hurt you if I didn't pay. I've been trapped in my own scheme for months, terrified to tell the police because I was complicit in the original plan." Tom's voice, when he finally spoke, carried a cold fury that reminded Eleanor of Robert's rare moments of absolute anger. "You hired a criminal to terrorize our mother because you thought you knew what was best for her. Your arrogance nearly got her killed." The family that had been torn apart by kidnapping 30 years earlier was fracturing again, this time along lines of betrayal and misplaced love. Eleanor sat in the middle of it all, surrounded by the children she had raised and lost and found again, while the dog who had truly protected her lay unconscious on an operating table, his heart struggling to sustain the life he had risked so freely. In the distance, the first light of dawn was beginning to show through the clinic windows, illuminating a world that had been forever changed by the night's revelations and sacrifices. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the new kitchen window of Eleanor Patterson's home, illuminating a scene that would have seemed impossible during those dark December days when violence had shattered her world. The house that had once echoed with loneliness now hummed with the gentle chaos of a family learning to heal together. Tom stood at the stove preparing breakfast with the careful attention of someone who had spent 30 years dreaming of such ordinary moments, while Eleanor sat at the kitchen table surrounded by 5 German shepherds in various stages of alertness. Max had survived his surgery, though Dr. Walsh's predictions about his heart condition had proven accurate. The magnificent dog, who had once weighed nearly 100 pounds of pure muscle, now moved with the careful deliberation of someone managing a chronic illness. His medication routine rivaled Eleanor's own, and their shared morning ritual of pills and gentle encouragement had become a touching symbol of mutual dependence and care. "Come on, old friend," Eleanor murmured as she helped Max to his feet for their slow walk to the backyard. "We're both running on borrowed time, but we're not done yet." The 4 puppies that Bella had delivered during that traumatic night had grown into magnificent young adults, their protective instincts already evident despite their youth. Tom had named them Hope, Faith, Grace, and Justice, names that reflected the values their family had rediscovered through trial and loss. Watching them play in the morning sunlight, Eleanor marveled at how life had a way of regenerating itself even in the aftermath of devastation. Tom's integration into the household had been both natural and miraculous. The man who had spent 2 years caring for her from the shadows now filled the role of devoted son with an intensity that sometimes overwhelmed Eleanor. He had moved into his childhood bedroom, which Robert had maintained as a shrine for 30 years, and the sight of him reading the morning paper in his father's chair felt like the universe correcting a fundamental error. "The contractor says the security system will be fully operational by next week," Tom reported, as he set Eleanor's coffee cup beside her with the precision of someone who had studied her preferences for months. "Motion sensors, cameras, and direct connection to the state police dispatch. No one will ever catch us unprepared again." Eleanor nodded, though part of her mourned the loss of innocence that made such measures necessary. The house that had once represented sanctuary now bore the visible scars of violence: reinforced doors, bulletproof windows, and emergency communication systems that turned their home into something resembling a fortress. Yet these modifications also represented hope, the determination to rebuild rather than surrender to fear. Sarah's situation remained the most complicated aspect of their healing process. The legal consequences of her actions had been severe, but not insurmountable. Her cooperation with the investigation into Marcus Reed's criminal network had earned her a plea agreement that avoided prison time, but her legal career was finished, and the public shame had isolated her from the professional community that had once defined her identity. "She called again yesterday," Tom mentioned carefully, his tone neutral in the way that indicated careful emotional management. "Third time this week." Eleanor's relationship with her daughter existed in a state of complicated suspension. The love remained battered but unbroken, but trust was a more fragile thing that required careful reconstruction. Sarah's letters from her court-mandated therapy sessions showed genuine remorse and growing understanding of how her need to control had nearly destroyed everyone she claimed to love. "What did she say?" Eleanor asked, though she wasn't certain she wanted to hear the answer. "She wants to visit. Says she has something important to tell us in person." Tom's hesitation suggested he shared Eleanor's ambivalence about face-to-face contact with Sarah. "She's been clean from gambling for 4 months now, attending meetings twice a week." The revelation of Sarah's gambling addiction had explained much about her desperate financial manipulation and her willingness to risk her mother's safety for access to the house's equity. The successful lawyer who had appeared to have everything under control had been drowning in debt, betting larger and larger amounts in an attempt to solve problems that only grew worse with each failed attempt. Eleanor's decision about whether to see Sarah was complicated by her own process of healing. The nightmares had finally begun to fade, and her daily routine with the dogs provided the structure and purpose she needed to move forward. Tom's presence filled the loneliness that had nearly consumed her, and the prospect of disrupting this fragile peace with Sarah's complicated emotions felt both necessary and terrifying. "Tell her she can come for Sunday dinner next week," Eleanor finally decided. "But make it clear that this is about rebuilding, not pretending the past didn't happen." The doorbell's chime interrupted their conversation, bringing with it the familiar excitement of the younger dogs and Max's more measured response to visitors. Through the security monitor Tom had installed, they could see Dr. Walsh's veterinary truck in the driveway, arriving for Max's weekly examination. These medical visits had become both routine and emotionally charged events. Each examination carried the possibility of good news or devastating decline, and Eleanor found herself holding her breath as Dr. Walsh listened to Max's heart with the same intensity she had once brought to human patients in critical condition. "His heart rhythm is actually more stable this week," Dr. Walsh announced after completing her examination. "The new medication seems to be helping, and his weight is holding steady. Whatever you're doing, keep it up." Eleanor felt tears of relief. She hadn't realized she was holding back. Each week that Max remained stable was a gift, and his continued presence in her life felt like a miracle she didn't deserve but desperately needed. The dog who had saved her life was now allowing her to save his, their mutual dependence creating a bond that transcended the ordinary relationship between human and animal. Tom's own healing process had involved reconnecting with memories that had been buried for 3 decades. He spent hours in Robert's study, reading through the case files that documented his father's relentless search for his missing son. The love and determination evident in Robert's meticulous notes had finally convinced Tom that he had been wanted, missed, and mourned by parents who never gave up hope. "I found something yesterday," Tom said after Dr. Walsh had left, his voice carrying the excitement of discovery. He disappeared into Robert's study and returned with a manila envelope marked Thomas, Age Progression Photos. Eleanor's hands trembled as she opened the envelope and saw images of what her son might have looked like at various ages throughout his missing years. The computer-generated faces showed a progression from toddler to adult that was remarkably accurate, particularly the most recent projection that could have been Tom's driver's license photo. "Dad never stopped looking," Tom said quietly. "Even after the official investigation was closed, even when everyone told him to accept that I was probably dead, he kept updating these photos and following leads." Eleanor studied the progression photos with the intensity of someone trying to memorize every detail. These images represented Robert's refusal to surrender hope, his absolute belief that their son would someday come home. The fact that Tom was now sitting beside her, helping her heal while healing himself, felt like Robert's final gift to his family. The afternoon brought visitors from town, neighbors and friends who had rallied around Eleanor after learning about the attack and the remarkable story of Tom's return. The isolation that had once characterized her existence had been replaced by a community of support that included everyone from Mrs. Henderson next door to the young couple down the street who regularly brought fresh vegetables from their garden. "You know," Eleanor said as she watched Tom playing with the puppies in the backyard while Max supervised from his favorite sunny spot on the deck, "I spent so many years thinking I had lost everything that mattered. Your father, my health, my independence, my purpose. I never imagined that losing everything might be the beginning of finding what I really needed." Tom looked up from where Justice was attempting to steal his shoelaces, his smile carrying the uncomplicated joy of someone who had finally found his place in the world. "Dad used to say that God works in mysterious ways. I never understood what that meant until I realized that getting lost was the only way I could learn how to come home." As evening approached and the dogs settled into their familiar positions around the house, Eleanor felt a peace she hadn't experienced since Robert's death. Her family was unconventional. A son recovered from kidnapping, a daughter struggling with addiction and legal consequences, and 5 German shepherds who served as both companions and protectors. But it was hers, built from love and loss and the determination to heal together. The house that had once felt like a prison of memories had become a sanctuary of second chances, where broken things could be mended and lost children could find their way home. Sometimes, life's greatest blessings come disguised as our deepest losses. Eleanor Patterson thought she had lost everything that mattered: her beloved husband, her sense of purpose, her connection to family. At 72, living alone in a house that echoed with memories, she felt forgotten by a world that had moved on without her. But when 4 abandoned German Shepherd puppies needed saving, Eleanor discovered that rescuing them was actually rescuing herself. These loyal companions didn't just fill her empty days, they became her protectors, her purpose, and ultimately the bridge that brought her long-lost son home after 30 years. Through heartbreak and healing, betrayal and forgiveness, Eleanor learned that family isn't always about blood relations. Sometimes it's about who shows up when you're broken, who stays when others leave, and who loves you unconditionally, whether they walk on 2 legs or 4. Her story reminds us that it's never too late for second chances, that our greatest trials can become our most profound blessings, and that the love we give always finds a way to return to us, often in the most unexpected forms. What unexpected blessing emerged from your most difficult season? Have you ever experienced the healing power of caring for someone or something that needed you as much as you needed them? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.